My name is Eleanor Vance, and for 35 years, I have been the ghost inhabiting a masterpiece. They say that behind every great man there is a woman, but they never tell you that sometimes that woman is the one actually holding the pen, while the man simply signs his name in bold, arrogant strokes. At 62, I look at the graying hair in the mirror and see a lawyer's mind trapped in a homemaker's shadow. I spent my youth mastering the intricacies of intellectual property law, only to retire early to become the silent engine driving my husband Julian's architectural empire. Every iconic curve of the skyline, every structural marvel that bears the Vance name, possesses a soul that belongs to me. I was the one who stayed up until 3 a.m, correcting his load-bearing calculations and refining the aesthetic symmetry of his blueprints while he slept soundly, dreaming of the applause he hadn't yet earned. I thought I was building a legacy for our family, a fortress of security for our children, Marcus and Brianna. I believed that my invisibility was a small price to pay for a lifetime of shared devotion. But as the champagne flowed at our anniversary gala, I realized that I wasn't a partner in a fortress. I was a prisoner in a house of cards, and the people I loved most were the ones holding the matches. Before we continue exploring the cracks in Eleanor's luxurious mansion, after you take a second to like the video and leave a comment sharing your feelings, I would like to send wishes of peace to all of you. From where are you listening to this story, and what time is it on your clock? I really want to connect with everyone. Let's continue. The evening of our 35th wedding anniversary began with the scent of expensive lilies and the suffocating weight of a silk gown that cost more than my first car. Our estate in Connecticut was glowing, illuminated by hundreds of amber lights draped through the ancient oaks, casting long, flickering shadows across the stone driveway. It was supposed to be a celebration of the Vance legacy, a night to honor Julian's recent Lifetime Achievement Award from the Architectural League. As I stood in the foyer, greeting guests whose names I only remembered because of the meticulous spreadsheets I kept, I felt a familiar hollow ache in my chest. I watched Julian across the room, tall and silver-haired, the very picture of a distinguished visionary. He was holding court near the grand fireplace, a crystal glass of scotch in one hand, gesturing expansively as he told the story of how he conceived the design for the Neo-Glass Tower in Manhattan. He spoke of inspiration striking him like a bolt of lightning in the middle of the night. He didn't mention that the lightning was actually me sitting at the kitchen table with a red pen, redesigning the entire facade because his original draft was structurally impossible and aesthetically derivative. I moved through the crowd like a specter, a polite smile fixed on my face, offering refills and making small talk about the weather. No one asked me about my day or my thoughts on the industry. To them, I was simply the elegant Mrs. Vance, the woman who ensured the catering was flawless and the linens were crisp. I saw my son Marcus standing by the bar. At 32, he inherited Julian's jawline and his entitlement. He didn't even look up when I approached, his eyes glued to his phone, as he calculated his latest venture capital loss. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it, Marcus?" I asked softly, reaching out to brush a stray piece of lint from his tuxedo jacket. He flinched slightly, pulling away as if my touch was an inconvenience. "Yeah, Mom, great. Listen, did Dad mention the bridge loan I asked about? The tech startup in Palo Alto needs a cash infusion by Friday, or I'm going to lose my equity position. He's being tight-fisted tonight." "He's focused on his award, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady despite the sting of his dismissal. "And perhaps we should talk about your business plan before we commit more of the family's savings." Marcus let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "Savings? Mom, we're the Vances. The money is there because Dad is a genius. Don't start with the legalistic lecture again. You've been retired so long you've forgotten how the real world works." His words felt like a physical blow. I had spent 15 years practicing law at the highest level to ensure Julian's contracts were airtight and our family's wealth was protected, yet to my own son, I was an artifact of a forgotten era. Before I could respond, my daughter Brianna joined us, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She was dressed in a designer slip dress that was far too thin for the autumn air, her face tight with a frantic kind of energy. "Mom, thank God," she said, not as a greeting but as an opening to a demand. "I need you to talk to the gallery owner in Chelsea. I told her I'd buy that installment for my loft, but the wire transfer didn't go through. Can you just handle it? Julian said you manage the domestic accounts." "The domestic accounts are for the house, Brianna," I said. "That installation is $50,000. We agreed you would stay within your monthly allowance until your interior design firm started showing a profit." Brianna rolled her eyes, a gesture she hadn't outgrown since she was 16. "It's an investment in my brand, Mom. Don't be so suburban. Besides, Dad said he'd cover it if I made a good showing tonight at the gala. Just make it happen, okay?" She didn't wait for an answer. She turned her back to me to flag down a waiter for a glass of champagne. I stood there, sandwiched between my two children, feeling more like an ATM than a mother. They didn't see the woman who had coached them through their SATs, the woman who had negotiated their first apartment leases, or the woman who was currently the silent partner in every single one of their father's successes. They saw a facilitator, a shadow. Later that evening, the room fell silent as Julian stood on a small podium to give his speech. The applause was deafening. He looked down at the gold medal in his hand, his eyes shimmering with a well-rehearsed humility. "Architecture," Julian began, his voice booming and resonant, "is the art of making the impossible permanent. It requires a singular vision, a willingness to stand alone against the elements, to create something that will outlast us all. I am honored to receive this, not for myself, but for the legacy of the Vance name." He went on for 10 minutes, thanking the developers, the city planners, and even his old professors. I waited for the moment his eyes would find mine. I waited for the simple mention of my name, not even as his inspiration, but just as his partner. I had spent the last 6 months meticulously refining the very project this award was honoring. I had solved the plumbing crisis in the blueprints that would have flooded the lower levels. I had negotiated the land rights when the project was nearly canceled. "And finally," Julian said, his smile widening as he looked toward me, "to my lovely wife, Eleanor. Thank you for keeping our home so beautiful and for being the rock that allows me to soar into the clouds." The room erupted in another round of applause. People turned to me, nodding with that condescending warmth reserved for supportive spouses. Julian didn't look at me with love. He looked at me with the same satisfaction he felt when looking at a well-maintained piece of equipment. I was the rock, not a person, but a heavy, silent object that kept his life from drifting while he took all the credit for the flight. As the party wound down and the last of the town cars pulled away, the silence of the house felt heavier than the noise of the crowd. Julian was in high spirits, humming to himself as he loosened his tie in our master bedroom. "A triumph, Eleanor, don't you think?" he asked, not looking at me as he tossed his jacket onto the chair. "That developer from Chicago wants to talk about a skyscraper project in the spring. We're going to be busier than ever." I sat on the edge of the bed, slowly unpinning the pearls from my hair. "We? Julian, I was thinking that after 35 years, maybe it's time we actually retired. We have enough. We could travel. We could actually be a family without the blueprints between us." Julian stopped humming. He turned to me, a flicker of something sharp and cold passing through his eyes before he masked it with a patronizing grin. "Retire? And let the Vance name fade? Don't be silly, Eleanor. You know I can't function without the work. And frankly, the children's lifestyles require the income. You just focus on the house and the upcoming holiday planning. I've got everything under control." He walked into his dressing room, closing the door behind him. I stayed on the bed, the silence ringing in my ears. For the first time in 35 years, the house felt foreign to me. The walls I had helped design, the floors I had chosen, the children I had raised, they all felt like they belonged to someone else. I realized then that I wasn't just invisible to the world. I was being erased from my own life by the very people I had spent that life protecting. But Julian had forgotten one thing. He thought I was just the rock at the base of his tower. He forgot that if you shift the rock, the entire structure begins to lean. And I was tired of being the only thing holding it up. The morning after our anniversary felt like a hangover of the soul. The house was too quiet, the air thick with the lingering scent of stale champagne and expensive perfume. Julian had left early for a site visit in Hartford, leaving me alone in the wreckage of our celebration. I found myself in his home office, a room that smelled of old leather and tobacco, a space I usually only entered to clean or to fix the technical errors in his latest drafts. I wasn't looking for a betrayal. I was looking for a misplaced file on our joint property taxes. But life has a way of showing you what you need to see exactly when you stop looking for it. I was rummaging through the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk when I noticed a false back, a sliver of wood that didn't align with the grain. My lawyer's instinct, dormant but not dead, flared to life. Behind that panel wasn't just a file, it was a ghost. I pulled out a thick envelope containing a secondary will and a series of intellectual property transfers papers that moved the rights to his 3 most profitable designs into a trust I had never heard of. But it wasn't the numbers that stopped my heart. It was the name of the beneficiary, Claire Montgomery, a woman who didn't exist in our social circles, yet on paper, she was being handed the keys to my life's work. I sat there on the floor, the cold marble seeping through my robe, realizing that the man I had spent 35 years building a pedestal for had been busy building a trapdoor beneath my feet. The silence of the office became deafening as I spread the documents across the floor. My hands, usually so steady when drafting complex litigation, were trembling so violently that the paper rattled like dry leaves. I recognized the formatting of the will immediately. It was a sophisticated forgery of my own drafting style, designed to look as though I had reviewed and approved it. It stated that in the event of Julian's death, the lion's share of the Vance architectural patents and the residual income from the Neo-Glass Tower would bypass our children and me entirely, flowing instead into a private foundation controlled by this Claire Montgomery. "Who are you?" I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded small, like a child's, lost in the vastness of a house that suddenly felt like a stranger's territory. I reached deeper into the hidden compartment and found a leather-bound sketchbook. It wasn't filled with blueprints or structural elevations. It was filled with her. Sketches of a woman much younger than me, with sharp features and an effortless grace, captured in moments of domestic intimacy, reading by a window, sleeping in a bed that wasn't ours, laughing over a glass of wine. The dates on the sketches went back 12 years. 12 years of Julian coming home late from late-night renders. 12 years of him telling me my presence at certain industry dinners wasn't necessary because they were strictly business. I felt a wave of nausea so powerful I had to press my forehead against the cool edge of the desk. The betrayal wasn't just the woman, it was the theft of my mind. The documents included a transfer of creative authorship rights. Julian had filed papers claiming sole intellectual origin for the projects I had practically co-authored, and then he had signed those rights over to Claire. He wasn't just cheating on me in a bed, he was cheating on me in the very fabric of my professional identity. He was giving away the only thing I had left of myself. I heard the heavy front door creak open, and the rhythmic thud of Julian's Italian leather loafers on the hardwood. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stayed there, surrounded by the paper trail of my own erasure. "Eleanor?" His voice called out, buoyant and full of that practiced charm. "You won't believe the Hartford site. They want to expand the atrium. It's going to be the jewel of the East Coast." He walked into the office, still wearing his tailored overcoat, his face flushed with the cold air and his own success. He stopped abruptly when he saw me on the floor. His eyes darted to the documents, then back to my face. For a split second, the mask slipped. I saw a flash of pure, cold calculation, the look of a predator weighing its options. Then, just as quickly, the mask of the concerned husband was back in place. "Good God, Eleanor, what are you doing on the floor? Are you feeling dizzy again?" He moved toward me, reaching out a hand, but I flinched as if he were brandishing a knife. "Who is Claire, Julian?" I asked. My voice wasn't shaking anymore. It was dead, flat and cold as a winter pond. Julian froze. He looked at the sketchbook lying open to a page where he had drawn Claire in a sun hat. He sighed, a long, weary sound, as if I were the one being difficult. He walked over to the window, staring out at the manicured lawn I had spent years tending. "She's a colleague, Eleanor. Someone who understands the pressures of the current market in a way. Well, in a way that someone who has been out of the game as long as you have might find difficult to grasp." "A colleague?" I stood up, holding the transfer papers. "You signed over the rights to the Manhattan Project to her. My project. The one I stayed up with you for 3 months straight to finish while you were having consultations in the city. You're giving her my life, Julian." He turned around, and his face was no longer kind. It was tight, the muscles in his jaw pulsing. "Your life? Eleanor, let's be honest. You've been a housewife for 15 years. You played with some drawings to pass the time. I am the one whose name is on the firm. I am the one who takes the risks. I needed someone who could move the assets into a more tax-efficient structure. Claire is an expert in offshore management. It's for the family's future. Then why is it hidden in a false drawer? Why is there a will that leaves Marcus and Brianna with nothing but the scraps of this house?" Julian took a step toward me, his shadow falling over me. "Because Marcus is a failure and Brianna is a spendthrift, They would burn through the Vance legacy in a year. I am protecting what I built. And frankly, Eleanor, your contribution was always more of a hobby than a career. You chose to retire. You chose to be the support. Don't try to rewrite history now just because you found some paperwork you weren't meant to see. He reached down and began calmly gathering the papers from the floor, his movements methodical and arrogant. He wasn't even worried. He truly believed I was too small, too domesticated to do anything about it. Go upstairs and lie down, he said, tucking the documents back into the hidden slot. You're overreacting. We have guests coming for dinner on Friday. I need you to be at your best. We'll talk about this when you're more stable. He walked out of the room, leaving me standing in the center of a life that had been looted while I was busy keeping the windows clean. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. I went to the window and watched him walk back to his car, his posture straight, his confidence unshakable. He thought he had buried the lawyer in me decades ago under layers of silk and social obligations. He thought that because I had loved him, I was blind. But as I watched his car disappear down the long, winding driveway, I realized he had made a fatal architectural error. He had built his entire empire on a foundation he assumed was static stone. He forgot that a foundation is the most dangerous part of a building to ignore. I went back to the desk and ran my fingers over the wood. I knew every inch of this house. I knew where the bodies were buried because I was the one who had helped him dig the holes. Claire Montgomery might have the papers, but I had the truth. And in my experience, papers can be burned, but the truth has a way of bringing the whole house down. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and began to think, not as a wife, not as a rock, but as a woman who was about to dismantle every single thing she had ever helped build. The sting of Julian's betrayal was a cold, sharp blade, but there is a specific kind of agony that only your own children can inflict, a dull, crushing weight that steals the very air from your lungs. For 30 years, I was the woman who kissed their scraped knees, who sat through every grueling parent-teacher conference, and who navigated the turbulent waters of their teenage rebellions with a patience I didn't know I possessed. I thought I was raising allies. I thought the bond of blood was a sacred covenant, an unbreakable shield against the world's cruelty. But as I stood in the shadows of the hallway that afternoon, listening to the muffled voices of Marcus and Brianna in the library, I realized that I had been raising strangers. They weren't just indifferent to my pain, they were architects of it, trading their mother's dignity for the promise of a golden inheritance. To them, I wasn't the heart of the home or the mind that secured their futures. I was a relic, a piece of old furniture that had become an inconvenience in their father's new, polished world. Hearing your own children discuss your erasure as if they were deciding what to do with a broken lamp is a moment that changes you forever. It is the moment you stop being a mother and start becoming a survivor. The library door was cracked just an inch, enough for a sliver of warm light to spill onto the Persian rug in the hallway, and enough for every toxic word to reach me with terrifying clarity. I had come downstairs to see if they wanted tea, a habit of care that now felt like a cruel joke. I stayed frozen, my hand hovering near the mahogany doorframe, as the conversation inside continued with a casual, businesslike indifference. "Look, the transfer to the Montgomery Trust is almost finalized," Marcus said, his voice ringing with that same smug confidence he used when he was trying to impress Julian. "Dad said if we keep things quiet and help him move the rest of the liquid assets before the end of the quarter, he'll double the seed money for the Palo Alto project. It's a clean sweep, Bree. No messy divorce, no litigation." "I just don't get why he has to be so cloak and dagger about Claire," Brianna sighed, followed by the distinct sound of her pouring another drink. "I've met her. She's sophisticated, she's connected. She's a much better fit for the Vance brand than Mom is at this point. Have you seen Mom lately? She just wanders around the garden or fusses over the linens. She's like a piece of the furniture we've had for too long. You stop noticing it's there until it starts to creak." "Exactly," Marcus replied with a light chuckle that made my skin crawl. "She's the invisible architect of the domestic bliss facade, but that facade is cracking. Dad's right, she's lived in this bubble so long she wouldn't know what to do with the firm anyway. If she finds out about the property transfers, she'll just get emotional and try to invoke some old lawyer logic. It's better this way. She stays in the house, she keeps her garden, and we get the resources to actually build something of our own. She's just so old world," Brianna added, her voice dripping with a pity that felt worse than hate. "It's embarrassing. Last week she tried to give me advice on the Chelsea Gallery contract, like she hasn't been retired since the Dark Ages. She doesn't realize that Julian Vance is the only reason people still say our name with respect. If she stays out of the way, everyone wins. I stood in the dim hallway, the silence of the rest of the house pressing in on me like a physical force. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had held them when they were babies, that had drafted the very trust funds they were now trying to manipulate. A piece of furniture. That was my value in the eyes of the people I had sacrificed my career and my identity for. I wasn't a person with feelings, memories, or a sharp legal mind. I was a stationary object to be moved or discarded to make room for a newer model. The betrayal wasn't just that they knew about Claire, it was that they had embraced her because she was useful to their ambitions. They had weighed their mother against a paycheck and found me wanting. Every holiday, every birthday, every "I love you, Mom" they had uttered over the last few years felt like a layer of ash in my mouth. They were helping Julian Totan, tossing aside the very legacy I had helped build, all while pretending to be the loving children I thought I knew. "We just need to make sure she actually goes on that wellness retreat Dad booked for her next month," Marcus said, his tone shifting back to the pragmatic. "Once she's tucked away in the Berkshires for a few weeks with no cell service, we can finalize the signature overrides. By the time she comes back, the ownership structure will be so layered she'll never find the thread." "God, I hope she goes," Brianna said. "She's been so moody since the anniversary gala. I can't deal with her sad mother eyes anymore. It's exhausting." I turned away from the door, moving with the silent, practiced grace of someone who had spent decades making sure everyone else was comfortable. I walked back up the stairs, each step feeling like a mile. I reached the master bedroom and sat in the armchair by the window, looking out at the sprawling estate. Julian was out there somewhere, perhaps with Claire, perhaps at the firm, confident that his plan was unfolding perfectly. And my children were downstairs, sipping my expensive scotch and plotting my exile. The pain was there, a deep, resonant throb in the center of my chest, but beneath it, something else was beginning to crystallize. It was a cold, hard clarity. They thought I was a creaking piece of furniture? Fine. They thought I was a relic of the old world who had forgotten how the real world worked? Fine. Julian, Marcus, and Brianna had made a collective mistake. They had forgotten who taught them how to play the game. They saw the domestic version of Eleanor Vance, the one who worried about floral arrangements and dinner seating charts. They forgot the Eleanor Vance who graduated top of her class at Yale, the one who was known in the courtrooms of Manhattan for a scorched earth policy when her clients were wronged. I didn't cry. I didn't storm into the library to demand an explanation. You don't alert the enemy when you've discovered their flank is exposed. Instead, I picked up my phone and made a single, brief call to a private courier service I hadn't used in 20 years. Then, I opened my personal laptop, the one they thought I only used for recipes, but do hoi fork, and began restoring the encrypted files I had archived before my retirement. The silence of the blood is a terrible thing. It tells you that the people you love are capable of anything, but it also gives you the permission to be just as cold. As I watched the sun begin to set over the Connecticut hills, I realized that the house was no longer my home. It was a crime scene, and I was no longer the victim. I was the lead investigator. They wanted to move the furniture. They were about to find out that this particular piece of the Vance legacy was bolted to the floor, and it was made of reinforced steel. There is a particular kind of stillness that takes over your body when you realize that the life you've built is actually a crime scene in disguise. It's not a frantic, screaming kind of energy. It's cold, heavy, and eerily quiet. For decades, I had allowed myself to become the ghost of the Vance Manor, a woman whose primary function was to ensure the silver was polished and the children's trust funds were topped up. I let Julian believe that my sharp legal mind had rusted over from years of choosing floral arrangements and managing household staff. I let him think that my greatest concern was the pH balance of the hydrangeas in the south garden. It was a comfortable lie for him to believe, because it made me predictable. It made me safe. But as I sat in the dim light of the library, the echoes of my children's betrayals still ringing in the corners of the room, that safely tucked away part of me, the attorney who could dismantle a hostile takeover before lunch, began to breathe again. I realized that Julian hadn't just been unfaithful to our marriage, he had been unfaithful to our partnership. He was treating me like a liability to be liquidated. He thought he was playing a high-stakes game against a retired amateur, but he forgot that he was the one who taught me where all the back doors were located. He forgot that a ghost is the only thing that can walk through walls without leaving a trace. If you are someone who has ever sacrificed your entire youth to be the launchpad for someone else's success, You will surely feel a pang in your heart seeing Eleanor being treated by her own flesh and blood as a piece of old furniture. Stay tuned because right now, the plan of the man she calls her husband is about to turn toward a darkness you wouldn't expect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the moment she takes it all back. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in nearly a decade. I woke up at 5 a.m., not to prepare for a garden club meeting, but to go to work. I sat in my small sunroom, the one Julian called my hobby space, and opened my old laptop. To anyone walking by, I was simply an aging woman looking at knitting patterns or perhaps browsing for vacation rentals. In reality, I was re-establishing the secure VPN pathways I had designed years ago when the Vance firm was just a 2-room office and I was the one filing the incorporation papers. Julian was a creature of habit. He believed that technology was a tool for his assistance and that his brilliance was beyond the reach of a digital trail. He kept his private records on a legacy server that he assumed I had forgotten how to access. It took me less than 20 minutes to bypass the encryption. My heart was thudding against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic reminder that I was still alive, still capable of being dangerous. I didn't start with the bank accounts. I started with the correspondence. I moved through thousands of emails, my eyes scanning for that name, Claire Montgomery. I found the thread buried under a folder labeled Maintenance Records 2022. It was a masterpiece of deception. Julian hadn't just been hiding a mistress, he had been constructing an alternate reality. As I delved deeper into the encrypted files, I came across a document that made the air in the room feel thin. It was a draft for a legal petition, prepared by a high-priced firm in New York, one I had worked with in my previous life. The heading read, Asterisk Petition for Permanent Conservatorship and Finding of Diminished Capacity. Asterisk. My vision blurred for a second. I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk until the wood bit into my palms. The petitioner was Julian Vance. The subject was me, Eleanor Vance. I read through the supporting evidence he had been meticulously gathering, notes on my forgetfulness, a log of days where I supposedly seemed confused about the date or time. He had even documented my reclusive behavior after the anniversary gala as a sign of late-onset clinical depression and cognitive decline. He wasn't just planning to take the money, he was planning to erase my agency. He was framing a narrative where I was no longer legally capable of managing my own affairs. You coward, I whispered, the words catching in the back of my throat. It was a brilliant, terrifying strategy. If he could convince a judge that I was mentally incompetent, he wouldn't need my signature to transfer the remaining intellectual property rights or the deed to our estate. He could simply act as my protector while he stripped the house bare. And the most heartbreaking part was the witness list at the bottom of the petition. Marcus and Brianna had already provided initial statements, testifying to my increasingly erratic moods and loss of touch with the family's professional realities. I felt a coldness settle into my bones that I don't think will ever truly leave. My own children weren't just waiting for me to go away, they were actively helping their father build a cage for me. They were trading their mother's freedom for the Palo Alto seed money and the Chelsea Gallery Fund. I didn't cry. The time for tears had passed when I heard them in the hallway. Now, there was only the work. I began to mirror his server, creating a hidden cloud partition where I could store every scrap of his fraud. I found the black account, the one he used to fund Claire's lifestyle and pay the retainers for the lawyers who were helping him bury me. I saw the transfers, the offshore routings in the Cayman Islands, and the deliberate mislabeling of project expenses. Julian was a brilliant architect, but he was a sloppy criminal. He assumed no one was looking. He assumed his wife was too busy picking out window treatments to notice that he was stealing the floorboards from under her feet. I also found the Montgomery Trust documents. Julian was moving the rights to the Neo Glass Tower, my most significant contribution, into a shell company where Claire Montgomery held 51% ownership. He wasn't just giving her his heart, he was giving her my legacy, the intellectual fruit of my 35 years of labor. I sat back as the sun finally crested over the trees, bathing the sunroom in a deceptive golden light. My mind was racing, connecting dots that had been invisible only yesterday. Julian wanted a wellness retreat for me. He wanted me tucked away in the Berkshires without a phone. That was the window he needed. That was when the petition would be filed. By the time I came home, I wouldn't be the mistress of the house anymore. I would be a ward of the state under Julian's benevolent care. A soft knock on the door made me jump. I quickly minimized the windows and pulled up a page of gardening tips. It was Brianna, leaning against the doorframe, a cup of coffee in her hand, and a false, sugary smile on her face. "Good morning, Mom. You're up early. Still obsessing over the South Garden?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the stranger she had become. I saw the greed in the set of her shoulders and the lie in her eyes. "Just trying to get ahead of the frost, Brianna," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "The hydrangeas are so delicate. If you don't protect the roots, the whole thing just dies off in the winter." "Well, you should take it easy," she said, stepping into the room and glancing at my laptop screen. "Dad and I were talking. We really think that retreat next month will be good for you. You seem so tired lately. You deserve a break from all this maintenance." "I suppose I do," I replied, forcing a thin smile. "I'll start packing soon. I think a long, quiet trip is exactly what I need to clear my head." As she walked away, satisfied that her old-world mother was falling right into their trap, I turned back to the screen. My hands were steady now. I had the blueprints of his betrayal, and I had the access codes to his downfall. Julian wanted to find me incompetent? He was about to find out that the ghost in his system was the only one who truly knew how to bring the whole structure down. He thought he was playing a game of checkers, but I was the one who had written the rulebook for chess. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to re-architect his entire reality until there was nothing left for him to stand on. The most dangerous lies are often wrapped in the softest silk. For years, I believed that Julian's grand gestures were his way of speaking a language of love he couldn't quite articulate in daily life. I saw the jewelry, the surprise dinners, and the spontaneous trips as reparations for the long nights he spent at the firm. Nights I now know were spent in a different kind of company. But there is a particular chill that settles in your marrow when you realize a gift isn't an offering, but a bribe, not a token of affection, but a blindfold. Julian sat across from me at breakfast, the sunlight catching the silver at his temples, looking every bit the devoted husband, while he pushed a gold-embossed envelope toward me. He called it a wellness retreat, a late anniversary gift to help me find my balance again. I looked at his hands, those hands that had signed the secret petitions to have me declared incompetent, and I felt a wave of nausea so profound it was difficult to maintain the mask of the grateful wife. He was smiling with his lips, but his eyes were already measuring the distance between me and the door, calculating how much easier it would be to strip my life bare once I was tucked away in a facility where my fragile mental state would be managed by strangers on his payroll. "It's called the Heights," Julian said, his voice dropping into that soothing, authoritative tone he used when he was closing a deal. He was buttering a piece of toast with a precision that suddenly felt sinister. "It's a very exclusive facility in the Berkshires. No phones, no internet, just holistic treatments and quiet. I've noticed you've been struggling, Eleanor. The garden, the house, it's too much for you lately. I want you to have 3 weeks of pure peace." I looked down at the envelope. The gold foil glinted, reflecting a distorted version of my own face. If I hadn't seen the files on his server, I would have thought this was an act of genuine concern. I would have felt guilty for my moodiness. But now, I saw the jagged edges of the trap. The Heights wasn't just a spa, it was a private clinical observatory. Once I checked in, the lawyers he'd hired would use my isolation as proof that I was unable to handle the complexities of our estate. 3 weeks is a long time to be away from the house, Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I focused on the steam rising from my tea, avoiding his gaze. "Who will manage the winter prep for the estate? The children's accounts?" Julian reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His skin was warm, but the touch felt like a shackle. "Eleanor, darling, Marcus and Brianna are adults. They've stepped up. They want this for you as much as I do. We've all noticed the lapses. The way you forget where you put your keys, the way you stared at the wall for an hour last Tuesday. We're worried. Let us take the burden for a while." I felt a flash of white-hot rage behind my eyes. The lapse last Tuesday was me sitting in the library, paralyzed by the discovery of his mistress and his theft. He was taking my grief and my shock, and relabeling them as dementia. It was a level of cruelty that made the affair feel like a minor offense. He was gaslighting me in broad daylight, using my own family as the fuel. "I didn't realize I had become such a burden," I said, forcing a small, self-deprecating laugh. It was a performance that would have won an Oscar. I squeezed his hand back, feeling the tension in his fingers. "Perhaps you're right. I do feel foggy. Maybe the Berkshires are exactly what I need." The relief that washed over his face was disgusting. He leaned back, his posture relaxing, the predator satisfied that the prey had walked into the cage without a fight. "That's my girl. I've already had the staff pack your trunk. The car will be here at noon." "Noon today?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "That's very fast, Julian." "Why wait to start healing?" he replied smoothly. "Brianna is coming over to help you finish up. She's very excited for you, Eleanor. She says she wants her real mother back." When Brianna arrived an hour later, she acted like she was preparing me for a coronation. She moved through my closet, picking out cashmere sweaters and soft leggings, talking incessantly about the amazing treatments at the Heights. Every time she looked at me, I saw the flicker of guilt she was trying to drown out with her chatter. She was selling her mother's freedom for a Chelsea gallery, and she was trying to convince herself it was for my own good. "It's so beautiful there, Mom," she said, folding a silk scarf with trembling hands. "They have this hydrotherapy circuit that's supposed to clear the mind. Dad says you just need a reset from all the stress." "Stress is a funny thing, Brianna," I said, standing by the window and watching the fallen leaves spiral across the lawn. "It usually comes from the things we don't say, or the things we find out that we weren't supposed to know." She froze for a split second, the scarf clutched to her chest. Her eyes met mine in the mirror, and for a heartbeat, the mask slipped. I saw the terror that I might actually be sane, and the even greater terror of what that would mean for her inheritance. Then she laughed a brittle practice sound. "You see? That's exactly what I mean. You're talking in riddles again, Mom. It's that brain fog. You'll feel so much sharper after the retreat." She came over and hugged me. She smelled like expensive jasmine and the cold metallic scent of greed. I held her back, feeling the fragile bones of the daughter I had once protected from every storm. I realized then that I wasn't just losing a husband, I was losing the very idea of a family. They were a unified front, a phalanx of betrayal aimed at the woman who had built the ground they stood on. Julian walked into the room, checking his watch. "The car is in the driveway, Eleanor. Are we ready?" I looked at them both, my husband of 35 years and my youngest child. They were standing side by side, a perfect portrait of a caring family. It was a masterpiece of staging. I felt a profound sense of revulsion, a physical need to be away from their lies. "I'm ready," I said, picking up my handbag. Inside, tucked into a hidden lining, was an encrypted thumb drive containing every file I had pulled from Julian's server and a burner phone I'd bought at a convenience store 2 nights ago. Julian walked me to the black sedan waiting at the front steps. He kissed my cheek, a gesture that felt like a Judas kiss. 3 weeks, Eleanor. Just focus on yourself. Don't worry about anything here. I'll handle the lawyers, the accounts, everything." "I'm sure you will, Julian," I said, stepping into the back seat. "You've always been so thorough with the details." As the car pulled away, I looked back through the rear window. Julian and Brianna were standing on the porch, waving. As the distance grew, I saw them turn to each other. They didn't look sad. They didn't look worried. They looked like they had just finished a difficult chore. They were already moving back inside, back to the house that was no longer mine, to start the final phase of their liquidation. I leaned back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. The driver was a silent man, likely instructed not to engage with the confused woman in the back. I felt the car leave the gravel driveway and hit the main road. They thought they were sending me to a place where I would be silenced. They thought they were giving themselves a 3-week window to erase me, but they had made a grave error in their architectural calculations. They had given me exactly what I needed: time. Away from their cameras, away from their prying eyes, and away from the suffocating pretense of being the rock of the Vance family. Julian wanted me to go to the Berkshires to clear my head. He was going to get exactly what he asked for. By the time I returned, I wouldn't just be sharp, I would be lethal. The heights he wanted to send me to were nothing compared to the depths I was willing to go to take back my life. I pulled the burner phone from my bag and dialed a number I had memorized from my old legal directory. It was time to call in a ghost of my own. There is a terrifying freedom in being forgotten. When the world and the people you once called your family decide that you are no longer a person of consequence, they stop looking for you. They stop watching your movements because they believe they have already mapped your destination. As the black sedan wound its way through the dense, leaf-strewn backroads of the Berkshires, I realized that Julian's arrogance was my greatest weapon. He had sent me away to be silenced, but in doing so, he had cut the tether that kept me under his constant, suffocating surveillance. For 35 years, I was the woman defined by the man standing next to her, the silent partner whose every decision was filtered through the lens of a Vance. But as I looked at my reflection in the car window, pale and shadowed but undeniably present, I saw the lawyer he thought he had buried. I wasn't going to a facility to be managed. I was going to a meeting that had been 20 years in the making. Julian thought he was the only architect in this story, but he had forgotten about the people he had used as scaffolding and then discarded once the structure was high enough. He had forgotten that a building is only as strong as the secrets buried in its foundation, and I was about to find the one man who knew exactly where Julian Vance had hidden the bodies. The driver dropped me off at the iron gates of the Heights, a sprawling stone manor that looked more like a prestigious boarding school than a clinical facility. I waited until the car disappeared back down the winding road before I walked, not toward the intake desk, but toward a small, nondescript coffee shop a mile down the road. I had told Julian I wanted to walk the grounds to clear my head, and with my confused reputation, they didn't question a woman wandering toward the tree line. I sat in the back booth of the cafe, my hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of tea that I didn't drink. 10 minutes later, a man walked in. He was older now, his once sharp posture softened by age and perhaps by the weight of a long-held grudge, but I would have recognized those eyes anywhere. It was Elias Thorne. 20 years ago, Elias was Julian's senior partner, the man who had actually founded the firm before Julian staged a boardroom coup that left Elias penniless and his reputation in tatters. Julian had framed him for a series of structural failures on a bridge project, a lie so sophisticated that it took Elias nearly a decade just to clear his name, though he never recovered his career. "Eleanor," Elias said, sliding into the booth opposite me. His voice was like gravel, tired but steady. "I have to admit, when I got your message on the encrypted line, I thought I was dreaming, or that Julian had finally sent you to finish me off." "Julian thinks I'm currently being sedated by a holistic therapist 3 miles from here, Elias," I said, leaning forward. I felt a strange surge of adrenaline, the kind I used to feel right before a major deposition. "He's moving. He's Totan. He's liquidating everything. My rights, the kids' trusts, the entire Vance legacy. He's handing it to a woman named Claire Montgomery." Elias's expression didn't change, but his grip on the table tightened. Claire Montgomery. That's a name I haven't heard in years. She wasn't just a mistress, Eleanor. She was Julian's silent partner in the Thorne coup. She was the one who provided the Anonymous's whistleblowing documents that ruined me. Julian didn't just find her, he's been keeping her in the wings for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to consolidate his power. The air in the cafe felt cold. The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. Julian hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been building a lifelong partnership with the woman who helped him destroy his first mentor. And now, he was using that same woman to erase me. "I have the server data, Elias," I whispered, sliding the encrypted thumb drive across the table. "I have the offshore transfers, the forged signatures, and the draft for my own conservatorship. He wants to declare me incompetent so he can finalize the transfers without a fight." Elias looked at the drive, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He always was a brilliant architect, but he never understood the physics of a collapse. He thinks he's built a fortress, but he's built it on a fault line of people he's stepped on. I've spent the last 2 decades tracking his financial shell games, Eleanor. I didn't have the legal standing to sue because he'd buried me so deep, but with you, with the wife and the primary co-author of his patents, we don't just sue him, we dismantle him. For the next 4 hours, we didn't speak of the past or the pain. We spoke of numbers, jurisdictions, and the specific weaknesses in Julian's offshore routing. Elias had a network of outcasts, accountants, junior architects, and legal aides who had all been burned by the Vance machine over the years. They were the strangers at the gate, the people Julian had ignored because he thought they were too small to matter. "He's using the Nashville Christian Community Fund to mask the anonymous donations and the scholarship fund for your brother," I noted, referencing the patterns I'd seen in the first story's logic, adapted to our current reality. "But the loan he took out against the estate, it's tied to a variable rate that triggers a disclosure if the debt-to-income ratio shifts. If we can trigger an audit of the Montgomery Trust, the whole house of cards falls. We need a catalyst," Elias said, "something that forces him to move faster and make mistakes. He thinks he has 3 weeks of your absence to work in peace. We're going to give him those 3 weeks, but we're going to feed him false data. I have a contact who can mirror his server. We'll let him think the transfers are going through, but we'll be rerouting the digital footprints to a secure escrow that only you can unlock." "And the children?" I asked, a sudden sharp pain lancing through my heart. "They're helping him, Elias. They testified against me." Elias reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. It wasn't the patronizing touch of Julian, it was the grip of a soldier in the trenches. "They aren't helping Julian, Eleanor. They're helping the version of Julian they think will give them money. When that money disappears, they'll turn on him faster than he turned on me. It's not a pretty thing to watch, but it's the only way they'll learn that blood isn't a currency." I looked out the window at the gray, overcast sky. I was supposed to be a victim. I was supposed to be a confused woman losing her grip on reality. But sitting here with Elias, plotting the financial assassination of the man I had once loved, I felt more sane than I had in decades. Julian wanted to send me to the heights. He was about to find out that the view from the top is very different when the ground beneath you starts to liquefy. "Let's start the reroute," I said, my voice cold and certain. "I want him to see the numbers moving. I want him to feel the success. And then, I want to be the one who tells him why the vault is empty." As I walked back toward the stone manor of the heights, blending back into the shadows of the trees, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I was no longer the rock. I was the ghost in the machine, and I had just found the man who knew how to turn the power off. The alliance was formed. Julian thought he was alone in his genius, but he was about to find out that the strangers he had created were the ones holding the keys to his kingdom. They say that before a great storm, the air becomes so heavy and still that you can almost hear the heartbeat of the earth. That was how the dining room felt on the eve of my departure for the heights. The table was set with the fine bone china Julian bought me in Paris, the silver polished to a mirror finish by my own hands, and the scent of slow-roasted lamb mingled with the sharp, acidic tang of an expensive red wine. I sat at the head of the table, watching the three people I had loved most in this world, Julian, Marcus, and Brianna, as they chatted about the stock market and the upcoming gala season with a casualness that felt like a serrated blade against my skin. They looked so perfect, so wholesome, a portrait of American success bathed in the warm glow of the chandelier. But beneath that veneer of domestic bliss, I could see the gears turning. I could see the way they avoided my eyes, the way Julian checked his watch every 10 minutes, and the way the children spoke to me with a saccharine, patronizing kindness, as if I were a delicate vase they were preparing to ship off to a dusty attic. I wasn't their mother or their wife tonight. I was an obstacle they were politely maneuvering around. I realized then that the most profound loneliness isn't found in isolation, but in being surrounded by your own flesh and blood while they are busy mourning a version of you they've already killed in their hearts. My dear friends, have you ever sat among your loved ones, listening to their laughter but felt like a ghost? Eleanor is sitting there, looking at her husband and the two children she painfully brought into this world, while they are secretly calculating how to divide her assets. That pain, perhaps only women who have passed half their lives can truly empathize with. "This lamb is exquisite, Eleanor," Julian said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He reached out and squeezed my hand, his touch lingering just a second too long, as if he were checking my pulse to see if I was still there. "You really shouldn't have gone to all this trouble. You should be resting before the long drive tomorrow." "It's no trouble at all, Julian," I replied, my voice steady, sounding more like the attorney I once was than the housewife I had pretended to be. "I wanted tonight to be memorable. I wanted us to have something to look back on while I'm away." Clearing my head, Marcus chuckled, swiping a piece of bread through the gravy. "I'm sure you'll love the Berkshires, Mom. No phones, no spreadsheets, no worrying about the firm's overhead. Just peace and quiet. Dad says the staff there is top-notch." "Oh, I'm sure," I said, looking directly at him, though I've always found that quiet can be quite dangerous. It's in the silence that people start to notice what's missing. Brianna shifted in her seat, her fork clattering against the china. She gave a nervous laugh. "You're being so cryptic tonight, Mom. Is that the brain fog talking? You've been saying things like that all day." "Perhaps," I said, a faint smile playing on my lips. "But before I go, I actually have some parting gifts for you all, small tokens of my appreciation for everything you've done for me lately." I reached down and pulled 3 small wrapped boxes from a bag beside my chair. The room went silent. The tension was palpable, a thick, invisible cord stretched between us. I handed the first box to Julian. "For the visionary," I whispered. Julian opened it slowly. Inside was a heavy antique brass compass I had found in the attic, one that had belonged to my grandfather. The glass was cracked, and the needle spun aimlessly, never settling on north. He stared at it, his face paling under the warm light. "It doesn't work, Eleanor," he said, his voice tightening. "I know," I replied softly. I thought it was a fitting metaphor, a builder who has lost his sense of direction, who doesn't know where home is anymore. Julian's eyes snapped to mine, a flash of fear or perhaps anger flickering in his gaze. He closed the box with a sharp click. "It's a very unique antique. Thank you." I turned to Marcus and handed him the second box. "For the investor." Marcus tore into the paper with his usual impatience. Inside was a stack of old, weathered blueprints from Julian's first project, the one I had stayed up for 3 nights straight to co-author when Marcus was still in a crib. I had circled my own technical corrections in red ink, and at the bottom, I had attached a copy of the very first check I'd earned as a junior associate, which I'd used to pay off Julian's gambling debts back in the 90s. Marcus stared at the papers, his jaw tight. "Why are you giving me these old sketches, Mom? They're just trash at this point." "Because you were so worried about Dad's legacy earlier today," I said, my voice as smooth as silk. "I wanted you to remember whose sweat actually built the foundation you're standing on. You can't build a future if you don't understand the debt of the past, Marcus." Finally, I turned to Brianna. I handed her a small velvet pouch. "For the artist." She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a silver key on a broken chain. It was the key to the Chelsea Gallery storage unit she thought I didn't know about, the one she had rented using a credit card Julian had hidden from me. Along with the key was a photograph I'd taken years ago of her and me in the garden, before she learned to value a price tag more than a person. "That key opens a lot of doors, Brianna," I said, "but it won't fix a broken chain. I hope you find what you're looking for in all those empty spaces you're trying to fill." The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the room seemed to have been sucked out. Julian looked at the compass, Marcus at the blueprints, and Brianna at the key. They weren't just gifts, they were indictments. For a moment, the masks they were wearing, the caring family masks, slipped entirely. I saw the raw, naked greed in Marcus's eyes, the guilt in Brianna's, and the cold, calculated fury in Julian's. "I think the wine has gone to your head, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. He stood up, towering over the table. "You're acting erratically. This is exactly why we booked the Heights. You're clearly not yourself." "On the contrary, Julian," I said, standing up to meet his gaze. I felt a surge of power I hadn't felt in decades. "I think I'm finally becoming exactly who I was meant to be. I'm just tidying up before I leave. You know how I am about the details." "Mom, you're scaring me," Brianna whispered, though she looked more like a cornered animal than a scared child. "There's nothing to be afraid of, sweetheart," I said, walking around the table to kiss her forehead. Her skin felt cold. "I'm just a piece of old furniture going into storage, remember? You don't have to worry about me anymore." I looked at all of them one last time. I saw the fear behind their eyes, the fear that I might actually know everything, but their arrogance was still their greatest weakness. Even now, they chose to believe I was just losing it. They chose to believe that my gifts were the ramblings of a fading mind, rather than the calculated opening moves of a grandmaster. "Good night, my loves," I said, my voice echoing in the grand, hollow dining room. "I'll see you when I get back, or perhaps when the truth finally catches up to you." I walked out of the room, leaving them sitting in the wreckage of their last supper. I didn't look back. I went upstairs, locked my door, and checked the encrypted burner phone. Elias Thorne had sent a single message. Asterisk, the reroute is active. The vault is priming. Asterisk, Julian wanted a quiet house while I was away. He was going to get exactly what he wanted, but he was about to find out that the loudest noise in the world is the sound of your own lies collapsing on top of you. I sat by the window, watching the moonlight hit the broken compass on my nightstand, and waited for the morning to come. The hunt had officially begun. There is a profound, almost spiritual liberation in realizing that the world can only see what you allow it to see. For 35 years, I was a fixed point in the Vance universe, as predictable as the tides and as reliable as the stone foundation of our home. Julian, Marcus, and Brianna moved around me with a careless certainty, never imagining that the person who kept their lives running like clockwork could simply stop. They viewed me as a backdrop to their own ambitions, a stage that would always be there no matter how hard they stomped upon it. But as the clock ticked toward the hour of my scheduled exile, I felt a strange, cold power surging through me. I was done playing the role of the fragile mother and the silent architect. I realized that the best way to prove your presence is to make your absence absolute. In the quiet hours before dawn, while the house was still dreaming of its own importance, I stepped out of the frame. I didn't just leave. I began to systematically dismantle the reality they thought was theirs. By the time the sun climbed over the hills of Connecticut, Julian Vance would find himself standing in a house that was no longer a home, clutching a fortune that had turned to dust, realizing too late that the woman he tried to erase was the only one who ever truly knew how to hold the structure together. The morning of the departure was meant to be my final surrender. The black sedan was supposed to arrive at 10 o'clock to whisk me away to the Berkshires, but by 7, I was already 20 miles away, sitting in the passenger seat of Elias Thorne's unassuming gray SUV. I had left my wedding ring on the mahogany desk, placed directly on top of the forged conservatorship petition I'd retrieved from Julian's hidden drawer. I didn't need to say a word. The silence of that empty room would speak louder than any confrontation. As we drove, I watched the morning mist cling to the trees, and I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't known since before I met Julian. My phone, the one Julian tracked, was currently sitting in the back of a cross-country Greyhound bus headed for Seattle, carefully tucked into a seat cushion. To the digital eyes watching me, Eleanor Vance was fleeing in a panic. In reality, I was standing perfectly still, watching the fuse I'd lit finally reach the powder keg. "It's starting," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. He handed me a tablet. The freeze went live at 8:01 a.m. Every joint account, every secondary trust, even Julian's offshore black account in the Caymans. We used the suspicion of elder abuse and financial fraud to trigger an emergency lock through the SEC's whistleblower portal. Since you're a primary shareholder in the firm's original patents, the bank had no choice but to comply until a full audit is completed. I looked at the screen, watching the numbers flash red. Julian's world was bleeding out in real time. For a man whose entire identity was built on the perception of wealth and invulnerability, this would be a death by 1,000 cuts. Back at the estate, the panic would be setting in. I could almost picture it, Julian coming downstairs, expecting to find a compliant, confused wife waiting by her luggage. He would find only the cold, empty air. I could imagine him calling Marcus, then Brianna, his voice rising in that sharp, jagged pitch he used when he was losing control. "Mom's not here." Brianna's voice would crack over the speakerphone as she searched my empty bedroom. "Julian, her car is in the garage. Her trunk is still packed. But she's just gone." I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes. I thought about the wellness retreat they had so lovingly booked for me. They wanted me in a place with no phones and no internet so they could sign my life away. Instead, I had put times in a cage. Without access to those accounts, Marcus's Palo Alto bridge loan would default by noon, Brianna's gallery deposit would be rejected, and Julian would be facing the most terrifying ghost of all, the Internal Revenue Service. The anonymous tip regarding the copyright fraud and tax evasion was delivered to the Department of Justice 3 hours ago, Elias continued, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. I included the metadata from the server transfers to Claire Montgomery. They're going to see that Julian wasn't just moving money, he was intentionally stripping an estate to evade future liabilities. That's a federal crime, Eleanor. "He'll try to blame me," I said, my voice steady. "He'll say I was the one who managed the books, that I'm the incompetent one who made the mistakes." "Let him try," Elias replied. "He forgets that your name isn't on a single one of those fraudulent transfer orders. He signed them all. He wanted all the power, so he took all the risk. He thought your silence was his protection, but your silence is now his greatest witness." Around noon, my burner phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus, forwarded through a masked number Elias had set up. "Mom, pick up the phone. Something is wrong with the accounts. The bank says there's a hold. Dad is losing his mind." "Where are you?" I didn't answer. 5 minutes later, a text from Brianna. "Mom, please. The gallery is calling. They say the wire was flagged for fraud. This isn't funny anymore. If this is because of the anniversary, we're sorry. Okay? Just fix it." The sheer entitlement of it was breathtaking. Even now they didn't think I had revolted. They thought I was having a moment, a little tantrum that was inconvenient for their shopping habits. They still couldn't see me as an adversary. To them, I was just a broken machine that needed to be kicked back into gear. The real blow landed at 2 p.m. Elias's contact inside the Vance firm messaged us. Federal agents had arrived at the Manhattan office with a subpoena. They weren't just looking for tax records, they were seizing the blueprints for the Neo Glass Tower. I had provided evidence that the innovative structural designs Julian claimed as his own were actually based on stolen proprietary algorithms from Elias Thorne's original work. Work I had helped Elias archive before Julian destroyed him. "He's going to lose the firm, Eleanor," Elias said softly. "The copyright infringement alone will trigger a clawback on every royalty he's earned in the last decade. He won't just be poor, he'll be a pariah." I looked out at the rolling hills of the New England countryside. I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. I had spent half my life building that name, and in one morning, I had wiped it from the ledger. I thought of Julian standing in his mahogany row office, watching men in suits carry away his files, his genius exposed as a series of clever thefts. I thought of my children, realizing for the first time that the old furniture in their house was actually the only thing keeping the roof over their heads. "Where are we going?" I asked Elias. "To a small, secure house in Rhode Island," he said. "It's not a mansion, but it has a view of the ocean. You can stay there as long as you need while the lawyers handle the fallout. Julian will be too busy dealing with the grand jury to look for you." I nodded, feeling the weight of the last 35 years finally begin to lift. Julian had wanted me to perform a vanishing act so he could take my place. I had performed one, but I had taken the entire stage with me. The ghost of the Vance Manor had finally left the building, and she had taken the keys, the money, and the truth with her. As we crossed the state line, I reached into my bag and turned off the burner phone. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to tell me who I was. I was just Eleanor, and Eleanor was finally, truly gone. The world loves a grand architect, a man who can stand against the horizon and point to a spire of glass and steel, as if he conjured it from the ether with nothing but sheer willpower. For decades, Julian Vance was that man. He was the face of modern elegance, the visionary who graced the covers of every prestigious design journal, while I was the woman in the background, carefully arranging the lilies for the photo shoot and ensuring the coffee was hot. But a building is a lie if the foundation is stolen, and a legacy is nothing but a shadow if the light creating it is a fraud. I spent 35 years letting him believe that my silence was a sign of my erasure, but silence is also where you gather your strength. It is where you document the truth, stroke by stroke, calculation by calculation. As I sat in the sterile, quiet office of my legal team in Rhode Island, watching the digital edition of the New York Times break the story that would dismantle the Vance myth, I didn't feel the rush of vengeance I expected. Instead, I felt a profound sense of justice, a quiet reclaiming of my own name. The man I called my husband had spent 20 years pretending he was the source of the brilliance, but today, the shadows were finally forced into the light, and I was standing there, no longer a ghost, but the primary witness to his long, elaborate theft of my soul. The headline was simple, yet it felt like a seismic shift in the earth beneath my feet. Asterisk the silent hand, the hidden author behind the Vance Empire. Asterisk. Beneath it was a detailed investigative piece that included side-by-side comparisons of Julian's award-winning blueprints and my own original, dated technical drawings from 2 decades ago. Elias Thorne had been thorough. He didn't just leak the story, he provided the metadata, the timestamps, and the testimonials from the junior draftsman who had always wondered why the genius, Julian Vance, couldn't explain his own structural load calculations during staff meetings. I looked at the photograph they used of me, a candid shot from a decade ago, standing at a drafting table in our sunroom. I looked focused, sharp, and intensely alive. I had forgotten that version of myself existed. "The petition is filed," Eleanor, my lead attorney Sarah, said as she walked into the room. She was young, barely older than Brianna, but she had a fire in her eyes that reminded me of my own days in the courtroom. "We aren't just filing for divorce. We filed a massive civil suit for intellectual property theft, copyright fraud, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. We've also filed for an immediate injunction to stop the conservatorship proceedings Julian initiated against you. The court has already seen the medical records you provided from your private checkup last week. You're as sane as anyone in this building." "And Julian?" I asked. My voice felt steady, anchored by the weight of the evidence we had meticulously gathered. "He's in a tailspin," Sarah replied, sitting opposite me. "His PR team has resigned. The firm's board of directors has suspended him pending an internal audit. But the real blow is the lawsuit. Because you were never an employee of the firm, but a co-author whose work was used without a formal transfer of rights, you effectively own a majority share of the copyrights for every major project he's done in 20 years. Julian doesn't just lose his reputation, he loses the legal right to claim his own portfolio. I walked over to the window, looking out at the gray Atlantic waves crashing against the Rhode Island shore. It was a cold, brutal beauty. I thought about the trial of shadows we were about to enter. It wouldn't happen in a crowded courtroom with a gavel, at least not yet. It was happening in the court of public opinion and through 1,000 legal filings that were currently stripping Julian of his armor. Later that afternoon, Elias joined us. He looked younger than he had in years, as if the weight of his own ruin had finally been transferred back to the man who caused it. He tried to reach out to me, Eleanor, Elias said, leaning against the doorframe. Julian called my personal cell 3 times an hour ago. He sounded diminished. He wanted to settle this like gentlemen. He said he was willing to give me a seat on the board if I helped him discredit the disturbed woman behind the article. He still thinks he can use you against me, I said, a small, sad smile touching my lips. He still thinks everyone has a price. He doesn't understand that for some of us, the price was already paid in blood, Elias replied. I told him the only thing I'm interested in is seeing your name on the lobby of that Manhattan tower. He hung up on me. But the hardest part wasn't Julian, it was the children. Around 4 p.m., Marcus called. He didn't sound like the arrogant venture capitalist I'd seen at the anniversary. He sounded like a terrified boy. Mom? Is it true? He asked, his voice cracking. The news. They're saying Dad is a fraud. They're saying you're suing him for everything. The bank called me Mom. They're foreclosing on the Palo Alto property because the Vance guarantee is no longer valid. I'm going to lose everything. You're going to lose the things you didn't earn, Marcus, I said, my heart aching but my resolve remaining firm. You knew what your father was doing. You knew about Claire. And you knew about the conservatorship. You were willing to let your mother be locked away for a bridge loan. We thought... Dad said you were sick, he cried. We thought we were protecting the family. No, Marcus. You were protecting your allowance, I said softly. The truth is out now. I am the architect. I am the lawyer, and I am no longer the bank. If you want to save your project, you'll have to do it with your own hands, not mine. I hung up before he could respond. Then came the text from Brianna, a long, rambling message full of apologies and excuses, claiming she was forced by Julian to go along with the plan. She attached a photo of the silver key I'd given her at the Last Supper. Asterisk. I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't mean it. Please don't take the gallery away. I'm your daughter. Asterisk. I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought of the 35 years I had spent protecting them from every cold wind. I realized that by protecting them from the world, I had failed to protect them from their father's greed. I didn't reply. Some lessons are only learned in the cold. That evening, I sat alone in the small living room of the safe house, a single lamp illuminating the legal documents spread out before me. I looked at the Vance firm logo on the top of the letterhead, a sleek, modern V. I took a black pen and carefully drew a line through it. The trial of shadows was nearly over. The man who had lived in the light of my talent was now standing in the dark, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to reach out and pull him back. I was going to let the sun rise on a world where Julian Vance was a footnote, and Eleanor Vance was the one who had finally designed a life that was entirely her own. I felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet hum in my veins. My reputation wasn't something he could give back to me. It was something I had never truly lost. I had just been waiting for the right moment to sign my name in the light. There is a unique hollow sound that a house makes when the money finally runs dry. It isn't the creak of settling timber or the whistle of wind through the eaves. It is the absolute crushing silence of people who have realized their safety net has turned into a noose. For 30 years, I believed that my children's inheritance was a matter of bank balances and real estate deeds, a fortress of comfort I had to maintain at any cost so they would never know the cold. I thought that by shielding Marcus and Brianna from the jagged edges of reality, I was being a good mother. I didn't realize I was actually raising 2 people who viewed me not as a person, but as a utility, a primary source of revenue that was expected to function without emotion or complaint. There is a profound, aching sorrow in realizing that the children you carried, whose first steps you cheered and whose feverish foreheads you wiped, have grown into the very architects of your destruction. They were willing to trade my freedom and my sanity for a bridge loan and a gallery fund. But as I sat in that quiet house in Rhode Island, watching the legal machinery I set in motion strip away every unearned luxury from their lives, I realized that the greatest inheritance I could give them wasn't a trust fund, it was the truth. It was the cold, hard floor of a world where you actually have to earn the ground you walk on. The truth about the empty accounts hit them like a physical blow on a Tuesday afternoon. I could almost hear the frantic clicking of their computer mice from 3 states away as they tried to log into the Vance family trust. I knew exactly what they were seeing, a balance of 0, followed by a transaction history that showed a total, irreversible redirection of funds. The money that Julian had tried to tow-ton to liquidate and that they had hoped to inherit by helping him bury me was gone. It wasn't in a hidden offshore account, and it wasn't tucked away in Claire Montgomery's shell companies. It had been moved through a legal loophole I'd discovered years ago, a clause in our original partnership agreement that allowed a founding co-author to redirect disputed earnings to a nonprofit entity in the event of documented fraud. The truth about the empty trust funds is just the beginning of the storm that is about to sweep away Julian's arrogance. A breathtaking turning point awaits in the final minutes as Eleanor decides to teach her ungrateful children a lifelong lesson about the value of a mother. Are you still following? Press subscribe to witness this spectacular overthrow right now. My burner phone, which I had kept for only this specific purpose, began to vibrate on the wooden coffee table. It didn't stop for an hour. First Marcus, then Brianna, then Marcus again. Finally, I picked up. I didn't say hello. I just waited for the noise on the other end to settle. Mom? Mom, what did you do? Marcus's voice was high-pitched, bordering on a scream. I could hear the background noise of a busy Manhattan street. He was likely standing outside the office he was about to be evicted from. The trust is empty. Everything. My lawyers say the money was moved to something called the Reeves Memorial Foundation. Who is Daniel Reeves? Why is our money going to some charity for woodworkers? I took a slow breath, looking out at the gray, churning sea. I felt a strange sense of alignment. Daniel Reeves was a man who understood that a house is only as strong as the integrity of the person who built it, Marcus. He was a man who worked until his hands bled to protect his family, while your father was busy stealing ideas to protect his ego. I decided that the money I earned, the money your father tried to use as a bribe for your silence, should finally go toward building something real. It's a foundation for vocational training, for people who actually want to learn how to build the world, not just own it. But that's our money. Brianna's voice broke in. She must have been on a 3-way call. Mom, you can't do this. The gallery owners are threatening to seize my inventory for back rent. They're saying the Vance name is toxic. I have nothing. You have exactly what I had when I started, Brianna, I said, my voice calm and devoid of the motherly softness they were used to exploiting. You have your mind and your hands. For 35 years, I was the one who made sure the bills were paid and the paths were cleared. I was the rock, remember? Well, the rock has moved. You were so eager to have me declared incompetent so Julian could take control. You were so willing to watch me be locked away in a facility in the Berkshires just so you could keep your credit cards active. Did you think the money would taste the same once you'd stepped over my body to get to it? A long, heavy silence followed. I could hear Brianna sobbing, a jagged, ugly sound of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. Marcus was breathing heavily, the sound of a man realizing his safety net had been shredded by the very person he thought was too weak to stand up. We were scared, Mom, Marcus whispered, the arrogance finally gone, replaced by a raw, naked desperation. Dad told us you were losing your grip. He said if we didn't help him secure the assets, the state would take everything anyway because of your legal history. We thought we were saving the family name. No, Marcus, you weren't saving anything. You were gambling on my erasure. You saw me every day. You saw me in the garden. You saw me at the table. You knew I was sane. But you chose to believe the lie because the lie came with a check. That isn't fear. That's complicity. What are we supposed to do? Brianna asked, her voice small and childlike. We don't know how to. We don't have anything else. You do what I did, I said. You find a way to be useful. The Reeves Foundation will provide you with a modest 6-month living stipend only if you enroll in a career counseling program and forfeit any further claims to Julian's remaining estate. It's a chance to become people I might actually respect one day. It's more than you gave me when you planned my exile. Mom, please, Marcus started, but I cut him off. I loved you both with everything I had, I said, and for the first time, I felt a single hot tear slip down my cheek. But I realized that by giving you everything, I taught you that nothing has value. Your father built a house of cards, and you both were happy to live in it as long as the heating was on. Now the house is gone. You can hate me for it today, but maybe in 10 years, you'll thank me for giving you a life that isn't a lie. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a profound, heavy grief for the children they could have been if I hadn't been so busy being the Rock. I thought about the name I'd chosen for the foundation. Daniel Reeves was a name I'd found in my old files, a man Julian had stepped on decades ago to climb a little higher. It felt right that Julian's stolen wealth would now go to people who actually understood the weight of a hammer and the honesty of a blueprint. The inheritance I left them was the vacuum where the money used to be. It was a space they would finally have to fill with their own effort. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the weight of my own motherhood shifting. I had finally stopped protecting them from the truth, and in doing so, I had finally given them a chance to survive. The lesson was brutal, and the the regret in their voices was a heavy price to pay, but some foundations have to be completely demolished before you can build anything that will actually stand. I was no longer the invisible architect of their comfort. I was the visible author of their reality. And for the first time in their lives, the Vance children were going to have to learn how to breathe on their own. There is a specific kind of cold that settles into a house when the soul has finally been hollowed out. It's not the chill of a winter draft or the lack of a fire in the hearth. It's the clinical biting frost of a legacy that has frozen over. For 35 years, I watched Julian Vance build monuments to his own ego, believing that as long as the exterior was gleaming marble and the glass was floor to ceiling, no one would ever notice the rot in the foundation. He treated people like temporary scaffolding, items to be used until the roof was secured and then tossed aside without a second thought. He thought he could do the same to me, that he could trade my life for a newer model and a cleaner balance sheet. But a building can only stand for so long when the person who actually calculated the weight-bearing loads decides to stop holding it up. Sitting in the small cottage in Rhode Island, watching the news reports of the Vance firm's collapse and the federal indictments being handed down, I didn't feel the fire of revenge. I felt a quiet, heavy sense of completion. The man I had once loved was no longer a giant in the architectural world. He was a small, desperate figure shivering in the shadow of his own lies. I realized that the greatest punishment for a man who wants to own the world is to leave him with nothing but himself. The knock on my door came late on a rainy Thursday evening. It wasn't the confident, rhythmic pounding of the Julian Vance I knew, the man who walked into rooms as if he owned the air inside them. It was a hesitant, scratching sound, like an animal looking for shelter from a storm it didn't understand. When I opened the door, the man standing there was a ghost of the visionary I had married. His tailored overcoat was soaked and wrinkled, his silver hair was matted against his forehead, and his eyes, those eyes that used to scan blueprints with such predatory precision, were bloodshot and wandering. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw him without the armor of his reputation. He was just a man, 65 years old, realized too late that he had burned every bridge he ever walked across. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "Please." I didn't know where else to go. The locks on the Connecticut house, they changed them. The firm is gone. Claire. She took the remaining liquid assets from the offshore accounts and disappeared to the Mediterranean. She won't answer my calls. I stood in the doorway, the cool salt air of the Atlantic blowing past me. I didn't feel a surge of pity, nor did I feel the need to scream. I just felt a profound, weary distance. "Claire Montgomery was always a better architect of betrayal than you were, Julian," I said softly. "You taught her that everything has a price, and everyone is replaceable. You can't be surprised when your best student learns the lesson too well." He stepped into the small living room, shivering, looking around at the modest furniture and the law books stacked on the coffee table. He looked like a displaced king in a peasant's hut. "The lawyers say you have everything, Eleanor. The patents, the royalties, the house, even the children's trusts are under your foundation. You've stripped me of my name, my life's work." "Your life's work was mine, Julian," I replied, sitting down and gesturing for him to stay where he was. I didn't offer him tea. I didn't offer him a towel. I am the one who corrected the math. I am the one who negotiated the contracts. I am the one who stayed silent while you took the bows. You didn't build a legacy. You built a debt. And now the bill has come due. Julian slumped into a chair, his head in his hands. The silence of the room was heavy, filled with the 35 years of things we had never said. I watched him and remembered the young man I fell in love with in law school, the one who promised me we would change the skyline together. I realized then that he never wanted a partner. He wanted a mirror that only reflected his own greatness. "I'm sorry," he choked out, the words sounding foreign and clunky in his mouth. "I made a mistake with the conservatorship. I was scared of losing the momentum. I thought if I could just consolidate the power for a few more years, I could make it right for everyone. For you, for the kids." "You weren't scared for us, Julian. You were scared of being ordinary," I said. "You were so afraid of people finding out that Julian Vance was a collaboration rather than a solo act that you were willing to lock me in a clinical facility to keep the secret. You traded my personhood for a statue, and now the statue has crumbled." He looked up at me, his face wet with rain and tears, reaching out a trembling hand. "What am I supposed to do? I have nothing. No one. Marcus and Brianna won't even speak to me. They say I've ruined their futures. Eleanor, please. Just help me get back on my feet. For old time's sake." I reached into the folder on the table and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a legal settlement. It was a blueprint I had drawn myself over the last few nights. I pushed it across the table toward him. "This is your final commission, Julian," I said. He looked at the drawing. It was a small, one-room structure, isolated on a plot of land I owned in a remote part of northern Maine. It had no grand atriums, no glass facades, no reinforced steel. It was a simple cabin, designed for a single person to live in absolute solitude. It was the architecture of loneliness. "What is this?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "It's a life lease," I explained, my voice as steady as the tide. "The Reeves Foundation will provide you with this home. It's paid for, and there's a small monthly allowance for food and basic necessities. But there are conditions. You forfeit the Vance name for professional use. You never contact me or the children again. And you spend the rest of your days in the silence you tried to force on me." Julian stared at the blueprint, his hands shaking. He saw the reality of his future: a small room, a cold wind, and no audience to applaud his existence. He saw the true cost of his greed. He wasn't being sent to prison. He was being sent to the truth. "You're burying me," he whispered. "No, Julian. I'm finally letting you live in the house you actually built," I said. "You spent your life making everyone else feel like a stranger in your world. Now, you get to be the only resident of yours. It's a perfect design, don't you think? Every load is balanced. Every wall is secure. There's no one left to betray, and no one left to lie to." He looked at me for a long time, searching my face for a flicker of the woman who used to worship him. He found nothing but the clear, cold gaze of a stranger who knew him too well. He realized then that the piece of old furniture had become the judge, and the trial was over. He picked up the blueprint with a defeated sigh, his shoulders sagging under the weight of a lifetime of arrogance. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say goodbye. He just turned and walked back out into the rain, clutching the drawing of his solitude like it was the last scrap of wood in a shipwreck. As I closed the door and turned the lock, I felt a massive, invisible weight lift from my chest. The confrontation wasn't about winning. It was about the release. I walked to the window and watched his shadow disappear into the darkness. Julian Vance was gone. The firm was a memory. The children were learning to walk on their own. And for the first time in 35 years, I sat down in the quiet of my own home and felt absolutely, undeniably free. I wasn't a rock, or a ghost, or a partner. I was just Eleanor. And the silence that followed wasn't a cage, it was a beginning. My name is Eleanor Vance, and at 62, I have finally stopped building monuments for people who only wanted to bury me inside them. For most of my life, I believed that love was a form of endurance, a long, quiet sacrifice where I polished the stones of someone else's legacy until my own fingers bled. I thought that by being the rock, I was the foundation of a family, never realizing that but the architecture of a life can always be redesigned. It took the cold betrayal of a husband and the chilling greed of my own children to teach me that my silence wasn't a gift to them. It was a cage for myself. Today, the skyscrapers that bear the Vance name still pierce the clouds, but they are hollow shells, stripped of the soul I gave them. I have moved on from the grand, deceptive designs of the past to a much smaller, much more honest blueprint. I've realized that the most beautiful structure you can ever build isn't made of marble or reinforced steel, but of peace, The kind of peace that comes when you finally stop asking for permission to exist and start living for the only person who was there from the beginning, yourself. The cottage I live in now is situated on a jagged stretch of the Rhode Island coast, a place where the Atlantic doesn't just meet the land, it challenges it. I designed it myself. There are no grand foyers to impress strangers, no hidden compartments for forged wills, and no heavy mahogany desks for men to hide their secrets behind. It's a simple space of cedar and glass, designed to catch the first light of the morning and the last warmth of the evening. For the first time in 35 years, I wake up and the only person I have to consult about the day's agenda is the woman staring back at me in the mirror. I spend my mornings walking the shoreline, collecting smooth stones, and listening to the rhythmic, honest language of the waves. There is no brain fog here. There is only the clarity of a life reclaimed. Julian is gone, living out his days in that remote cabin in Maine. I heard through the Foundation's legal team that he spends his time staring at the trees, a man who once wanted to dominate the skyline, now struggling to manage a wood-burning stove. I don't feel joy in his suffering, but I don't feel the need to alleviate it either. I have realized that forgiveness is a heavy burden I am no longer interested in carrying. People often say that you have to forgive to move on, but I find that a quiet, cold indifference is much more effective. I don't hate him. I simply no longer recognize him as a factor in my design. He was a flawed structural element in a building that has been demolished, and I have moved on to a new site. Marcus and Brianna send letters. They arrive every few weeks, thick envelopes addressed in handwriting I once cherished. I can see the return addresses Marcus from a modest apartment in Seattle, where he's reportedly working as a junior project manager, and Brianna from a shared studio in Portland. They are learning what it means to pay for their own coffee and negotiate their own leases. They write of their hoihern, their realization of how much I did for them, and their desperate hope for a family reunion for the holidays. I keep those letters in a small wicker basket on my entryway table. I haven't opened a single one. It's not an act of cruelty, though I'm sure they see it that way. It's a boundary. For 10 straight years, I sent my heart to my own parents in Nashville, and they returned it unopened, calling me a stranger. My children did something worse. They kept the gifts and tried to exile the giver. Now, I am simply returning the silence they once used as a weapon. I need them to sit with the emptiness, just as I did. I need them to understand that a mother's love is a well, not a faucet, and they spent too many years poisoning the water. Perhaps one day, when they have built something of their own without my money or Julian's stolen prestige, I will open the basket, but not today. Today, the silence is my sanctuary. The Reeves Memorial Foundation is flourishing. I spend my afternoons reviewing applications for the trade scholarships. It brings a deep, resonant satisfaction to my soul to know that Julian's liquidated assets are funding the educations of people who actually want to build. I see the names of young men and women carpenters, electricians, masons who understand that integrity is the most important material in any project. In a way, I am finally the architect I wanted to be in law school. I am building pathways for people who were once invisible, just like I was. Some evenings, I sit on my deck with a glass of wine and watch the sunset turn the ocean into a sheet of liquid gold. I think about the invisible architect I used to be, the woman who worried about the silver being polished and the linens being crisp while her life was being looted. She seems like a character from a book I read a long time ago. I don't miss her. I don't miss the mansion in Connecticut or the galas in Manhattan. I don't miss the weight of the Vance name. I've learned that a life isn't defined by the height of the buildings you leave behind, but by the strength of the peace you find within your own walls. I am no longer a rock for anyone else to stand on. I am the architect of my own joy, the author of my own truth, and the sole owner of my own time. The blueprints for the rest of my life are simple, honest, and entirely my own. And for the first time, the foundation is solid. If Eleanor's final blueprint has touched your heart, please comment justices below, subscribe to the channel, and watch other emotional journeys in the video appearing on the screen. Eleanor has taught us that, however late, wisdom and dignity always find a way to speak. Never mistake a woman's silence for weakness, because when they begin to redesign their own lives, there is no room for a traitor in that blueprint. Thank you for listening. I look at the small framed photo on my bedside table. It's not a family portrait, it's a picture of the shoreline at dawn, a vast, open horizon where anything is possible. I think of the children I lost and the husband I dismantled, and I realize that the most difficult person to forgive was the woman in the mirror who let them treat her that way for so long. but I have forgiven her. We are friends now, she and I. We have built a home where the truth is the only guest allowed, and for the first time in 62 years, we are finally, truly, at home.